All right, we're just about to get started. So thanks everyone that's joining. We have both the Zoom as well as LinkedIn Live. And then just so everyone knows, we will have a recording afterwards that will get sent out for anybody that registered for this webinar as well. So hello and welcome to our webinar today on preparing for cybersecurity resilience and incident response. This webinar is part of our ongoing effort to lead and educate cybersecurity practitioners on vulnerability management. My name is Patrick Garrity. I'm a security researcher and VP of marketing here at Nucleus Security. And I'm looking forward to today's discussion. I'm excited to welcome Erin Cho. Hey, Erin, how are you?
Hey, I'm doing great. Thanks for having me today, Patrick.
Yeah, it's awesome. So anyone that hasn't met Erin Cho, Erin is a senior executive from the office of the CISO at Mandiant, now part of Google Cloud, and former director of Cyber Threat Intelligence Integration Center at ODNI, as well as former FBI senior executive. Wow, that's a mouthful. Today, we'll be touching on real-world observations from Mandiant, including discussions on recent cybersecurity attacks that have exploited vulnerabilities, as well as 0 days. We'll discuss the importance of having a cybersecurity crisis plan in place, the advantages of working with third parties and federal agencies during a cybersecurity incident, and the role of leadership in building cybersecurity resilience. We only have an hour, and our goal is to make the session as valuable as possible for enterprise vulnerability management and security teams. I'll need your help, though. So please submit your questions either in the comments, which is open now, or the Q&A. Hopefully I got it right this time. The chat session is open for discussion now as well. So let's warm up. And just put in the chat, what is the biggest concern you have from a leadership perspective in cybersecurity today? Got to make sure that chat function's working today. And then also we'll be addressing any questions that come in from LinkedIn. So we're going to get started. And Erin, I think the first and most exciting part of this is things to consider in disclaimers, which is always important when you're talking about cybersecurity.
Yeah, it's funny. When you have a background like mine, you get to start every presentation with legal disclaimers. So just very quickly, yes, I was in federal government for many, many, many years, but I'm no longer there. And so anything I'm offering is just my personal opinion, personal experience, not the official position of any government position. The second thing to keep in mind is that whether it was when I was in government or as part of Mandiant or Google, we protect victims and we protect our customers. So if we refer to any situation in particular, it's because we have permission to do so. And I just want the audience to always remember that you should never hesitate to reach out to get help because you're concerned that maybe by working with professionals like a Mandiant or Google Cloud, you might end up being on the next PowerPoint, or the next slide deck, right? And you're not. That's not how we operate. We do protect victims and customers, and we only refer to them with permission. And the third one is more of an industry way of communicating. We talk about Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, etc. And I just want to make it very clear that we're talking about hostile nation state activity, not about the people from there, not about residents or citizens or descendants or anything like that. So I just want to be really respectful of that, but also have our audience understand how we use that terminology. Hey, Patrick, you're still on mute.
Thank you for reminding me. I appreciate it. So now we're going to take a look at some of the trends from 2022 from a Mandiant perspective, right? And curious, Mandiant has a lot of visibility into threat activity across the world. Can you provide some insight into what Mandiant is seeing from major threat actors out there today?
Yeah, sure. My goal today is to really share some data with our audience, some data and data points that might be really useful for you to take back into your office and use those data points to help support you in your cybersecurity program. I'll share some experience and perspective because, you know, I've seen the world from a certain perspective and position for many, many years in government. I've been in a leadership position for many, many years. That's where my expertise is. I'm not a hands-on keyboard person. So we're really going to take a broad, big view of the threats as well as security and defense, as well as leadership approaches today. So those are my goals. So let's talk about what trends we're seeing. So on the left-hand side, one of the things we're seeing is in our criminal actors and our ransomware actors, the ransomware went down ever so slightly last year in Americas, but not necessarily in other parts of the world. It went up a little bit. So that phenomenon is kind of interesting to us because in some ways it's possible that we've worked really hard to get a lot of information out and do it very quickly and work together and collaboratively across government as well as in the private sector. So maybe some of that information sharing has improved our ability to defend against some of these threats, and maybe some of the activity that government has taken against some of the main threat actors may have driven some of that activity down. It's possible. I'm not saying that we've concluded that, but these are things that we're thinking are possibilities for these trends that we're seeing. But it's still a big problem, and it's probably the biggest problem that businesses are concerned about today. But with ransomware, we are seeing a few things that are interesting. One is the threats are getting, in some cases, more personal in nature. We want to really alert people to this phenomenon because you really want to make sure that you're aware of what your digital profile is, not only yours, but your family as well, because that kind of information could be used to pressure somebody in a ransomware situation, and we don't want that to happen to people. Another thing that we're seeing is sometimes the threat actors are going after a particular business to be able to say that they did. So you may have somebody who's has a concern about your business or isn't happy about your business and retaliates in this particular manner. So this is where I see that physical security and IT security really working hand in hand, because you want to make sure that whatever's out there in your digital profile, or if you have disgruntled employees or disgruntled customers or whatever the case may be, that you're communicating that to your IT security so that they can watch for potential ransomware activity or other activity against your business. The other interesting thing that we saw is that last year, 40% of the ransomware cases that we investigated, the threat actors showed a preference for taking the time to access data. That's really important because, you know, it's not just a matter of them using the ransomware attack against you and then moving on, but they're really taking time to get into your data. So thinking in terms of what data is important to you, and later we're also going to talk about what data is important to the threat actors, and then really locking that down and protecting yourself. Some general trends that we saw is that the dwell time decreased slightly from 21 days in 2021 down to 16 days in 2022. But what's, I think, interesting is how are people finding out that they've been attacked? And they're being notified by external entities about 63% of the time. And when it comes to ransomware, 67% of the time that Mandiant was in the incident response of a ransomware attack, people found out because of a fully executed ransomware attack. So, you know, that tells us that we still have room to get better and get a little bit faster, even though I do think we are improving in many ways. Another huge trend that everybody, I'm sure, is aware of and is paying close attention to is this one-to-many attack type, right? So instead of any threat actor having to go against a particular victim one at a time, now they're going after our security software, our appliances, our network appliances, the virtual machines, the servers, VPNs, file transfer systems, firewalls, right? So now there's a discussion to be had about, do we need firewalls for our firewalls? I mean, it's a really interesting time because the very things that we use in our day-to-day business, and especially for security, are the places where the threat actors are using to use against us. So now the defender's mindset really needs to go to a place of, not only do I need this defense in depth just because it's always been a good practice and still continues to be a good practice, but what if your security software or appliance is compromised? How will you know? How will you detect it? And that to me is the critical question for a lot of defenders now as we enter this new time period. And then when we think about nation state activity, Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, you know, obviously last year we learned a lot about Russia and its capabilities, especially with respect to how it responded or how it attacked Ukraine. And so one of the things that we're concerned about there is that we saw at least 11 new destructive types of malware being used around the time of the invasion, post, just a little before, during, and after invasion, and 2 new ICS-focused types of malware that came out of Russia. We saw not only impact in Ukraine itself, but also sometimes there were regional impact that was experienced throughout Europe and other areas. So there were also times when the attacks were disruptive of critical services, but also seeking to disrupt recovery efforts. So there were ongoing attacks that continued, and defenders were experiencing these ongoing attacks as they were trying to recover. That's a new and different way of trying to prepare for incident response, because now it might not just be the initial disruption that you're up against. It might be an ongoing attack that you're up against. So these are things to really consider from a defender's perspective, as well as from an incident responder's perspective. You know, China continues to be very active with espionage, and they have capabilities, of course, in destructive capabilities. They're very active with information operations, as are other nation state actors, but they've been just particularly active in that space. Mandiant discovers about 30 new supply chain attacks every year, roughly, and most of those come out of China. Another thing that we see with respect to the threat actors from China is that very adaptable, very fast. So from the time that a new 0-day hits the news, right, is revealed in some way, sometimes they're able to exploit that within 24 hours. So that's what I call like an end-day race, right? The race is on. So China's demonstrated the ability to exploit those very, very quickly, which means you have to be able to learn about it and determine what actions you need to take very, very quickly. Iran continues to be active in espionage, and like I mentioned, the information operations. And then the North Korean actors continue to be active in a variety of areas, but particularly financially motivated. And we've seen them continue to do a lot of cryptocurrency mining and that kind of activity. So for all of these things, what I want to just refer you to is Mandiant does a lot of blogging on these activities. So make sure you check out the Mandiant blogs if you want to learn more, or go a little deeper, or just to stay in front of what's happening, because a lot of times we'll try to get those out in blogs. And then on the right-hand side of what you're seeing on the screen is a cyber threat score. And it measures the severity, and by that, of course, we look at frequency and magnitude of the attack. And like most heat maps, right, dark red is bad. The darker red, the worse it is. And the industries that are listed here, no matter how we look at it, typically you see that the targeted industries tend to be government is largely at the top, of course. And that number is probably even skewed more so by the fact that Ukraine has been under attack for so long. But government is always a top target. Financial services industry, the tech industry, legal and professional services, media and entertainment, healthcare, and then just below that we have education and manufacturing. So that's sort of what the world of threat actors and the targets tend to look like at a very high level.
Yeah, I think this is pretty fascinating. Like, I didn't realize the amount of impact the war has been having on, for instance, government attacks. And then you might not know an answer to this, but like when I'm a little bit curious, when attacks are happening so quickly, turning around 0 days, like, do you know, and you might not, like, do those tend to be then used targeted, or is it both?
I'm sorry, ask that again.
Yeah, when they're turning around that fast, like a 0-day exploit, and starting to weaponize it, do you know, like, is that typically targeted towards certain entities, or is it broad based, or a combination of both?
Yeah, such a good question. One of the things that Mandiant looks at and provides as part of a Mandiant Advantage Intelligence. So if you get our intelligence, you'll see this. We will publish in there who's using those exploits and against whom and how. So that gives you the ability to really prioritize, because different threat actors will use them very quickly against different targets. So you want to know those things. That intelligence can be really valuable, so that you could apply it and also put it into your risk analysis so that you know where you are in the threat matrix of that particular exploit.
Yeah, that's pretty fascinating that you're able to get that level of detail as far as what exploits or what groups are targeting what type of industries, which is great. So I think moving on a little bit, one of the things, M-Trends comes out every year, which is exciting to me. Very, very great report. And one of the things that comes out of it is Mandiant's view and look at attack methods. And I'm curious to get a little sense from you. I think you mentioned remote access or firewalls or VPNs or different things being targeted. But I'm curious to hear a little bit more detail into what attack methods and initial vectors the attackers are using.
Sure, and thanks for that. I do want to make our audience aware that anyone can go online and get M-Trends. It's available, so please do so. There's a lot of good information, good data in there that you can use to help you with your program. But what you see here is what Mandiant sees on the incidents that it responds to. So that's the context of this. It's not just world data, right? It's where Mandiant is responding. And just of note, I think it's interesting that in 2022, of the 588 newly tracked malware families, the top 5 categories consisted of backdoors, 34%, downloaders, 14%, droppers, 11%, ransomware, 7%, and launchers, about 5%. So that tells you where the threat actors are spending a significant time and investment and focus is maintaining persistent access, right? So that's really an interesting data point right there for defenders to be aware of. And then for the incidents that Mandiant responded to, for the times that we were able to identify the initial infection vector, 32% of the time it was from an exploit. So worldwide, it's probably still from phishing. That's probably still the widely the most common way that people are getting in. But we get called into the most impactful, the biggest breaches around the world. So for us, the most impactful breaches are coming from exploits. So then, of course, there's a lot of different exploits out there, right? And new ones are coming out all the time. But interestingly, 2021 was the year of the 0 days. We saw over 80 new 0 days in that year. That was more than the previous 3 years combined. That's a pretty significant shift if you think about how attacks are occurring. And in 2022, we saw over 50 new 0 days. So, not all of these exploits are 0 days, but it does give you an idea of just how active that world is and what's happening there and how sophisticated those attacks are becoming. And then, of course, as I mentioned, phishing being the number 2 for us. And then 3 is stolen credentials. I think that's really important because if we think about the way that these attacks are happening, if it is going to be some sort of a compromise of something you use for security that might be out of your initial control, right? But you bring it into your environment, you're depending on it, and it doesn't work. Well, what will you see? How will you detect that something's gone wrong? And we know that the threat actors go after credentials, obviously. They may come in with some stolen credentials and use those, or they may try to get them in your system. So the credentials are really something you want to be obviously, protecting, but also monitoring, because that's going to be a really big indicator whether somebody's in your environment who shouldn't be there or misusing them. And the misuse or the abuse or misconfigurations in cloud compromises tend to be the biggest issue that we're seeing there. And somebody asked me recently, they said, is crypto mining really that big of a deal? And 2/3 of the cloud compromises were for crypto mining. And that's one of the reasons that Google Cloud put out some protection related to crypto mining. So yeah, it is a pretty big deal, and it's something for you to really be aware of as a defender. Prior compromise is the next one, about 12% of the time. That's really important because, again, when you think about the fact that these malware families are developing backdoors and they're using all kinds of exploits and all these kind of different tactics are being used, then you look at like 12% of the time, they're using a prior compromise to come back in that tells me that we have to make sure that all those back doors are closed, that we have to make sure that the initial infection vector is completely, mitigated and remediated. So these are things that we have to just be far more vigilant about, right? We have to go back and check and test, right? Just because you close something, you have to make sure you keep testing it, making sure that it's closed the way that you think it is. And then the other, there's one data point that I think is so critical that came out of 2022. I just encourage everybody to jot this one down. But for the incidents that Mandiant was in, 27% of those, we found multiple threat actors in a single victim environment. So if you're doing incident response, right, you have to now, I think, be looking for multiple threat actors. So just because you find one does not mean that you're done, your job is finished. I think you have to be much more willing to take the time and spend the resources to ensure that you found all the threat actors, that you found all the back doors, that you've completely closed off the initial compromise so that it can't be used again against you.
I was a little bit in shock when I saw this, right? And the first time you look at the highest things, it keeps on being phishing, right? And exploits. And I think like variant reports are kind of like at the two top, but yeah, the prior compromise, right? I don't think a lot of people think about, and to hear 27% of incidences find multiple threat actors, it's not incredibly surprising, but at the same time, it's like, oh wow, when someone's owned, they're really getting owned,
right?
And we're seeing that more and more.
Right. So I want our incident responders to be looking for more, right? Do not make an assumption that you found that first one and you're done. You have to keep looking. You have to make sure that you've completely cleaned your environment. Another thing, just while we have this up, is the website compromises. That's a pretty significant issue because obviously you can't lock down everything. And I know one of the things that Google Cloud has rolled out is, a lot to do with secure browsing, right? So that's a key thing for businesses now to be considering. How do you make sure that your employees are not visiting fake websites, because we know that the threat actors like to use fake websites to come back and infect and cause infections, but even the legitimate ones, right? And then bring back infections as well. So, do take a look at secure browsing capabilities that are out there today.
Yeah, that's important. So there have been more recent attacks like Move It, Progressive, and they're using new techniques like data exfiltration. And I'm curious, as we look at initial attack vector, like now they're in and essentially exfiltrating data. How does this change how we think about cyber defense overall?
Yeah, so we'll move to that defense slide. Thanks. So there's some key things, right, that we got to keep doing. One is we keep talking about fundamentals. I think sometimes people get frustrated because it's like, oh, nothing new. We're going to talk about the same fundamentals. In some ways, I get excited about that and say, hey, look, I'm not here to tell you 1,000 new things that you have to do. I'm just saying, let's keep advancing the way that we do our security fundamentals. Let's keep getting better at those. Let's take them to the next level, right? And continue to really push ourselves in that area. It's hard, right? I know that. I know that it's not easy. I know that these things are not simple, but we have to keep going in that direction if we really want to make sure that we're giving ourselves every advantage that we can give ourselves. And we want to be intelligence-led. And do this from an informed position, which is why I always start with what's the threat landscape? What does it look like today? What's happening? What's new and novel? Or what's the same old thing that we continue to see occurring, and maybe even in new ways. So really being intelligence led and informed is critical. But we also want to make sure that gives us the capability to think like a threat actor. And we're going to talk about that in just a second. But then the other thing I think about when I think about improving our defensive capabilities, using automation, right? There are new developments in our industry all the time, and I'm really excited about some things that are happening now that I'll share. But using automation wherever possible to augment your capabilities and bring agility and speed. So let's talk about a few of these things. Again, going back to those fundamentals, even though we might get frustrated that oh, we're going to talk about the same things, the fundamentals again. Yes, but we still think that if done really well, we could stop, we used to say about 90% of the attacks. I don't know if that's true given the new attack types, but maybe. But you could certainly substantially reduce reduce the impact of a lot of threats, if not reduce the attacker's ability to come against you at all. So we still want to pay close attention to this. And when we talk about using intelligence to help us think like a threat actor, we always have talked about locking down the crown jewels, right? You still have to do that. You still have to do an assessment of the information that is most critical to you and your business and really lock that down. But you also need to be thinking about what information, what data, right? We talked about 40% of the time in a ransomware attack, the actors take time to access data. So what data do they access? What do they care about? Well, of course, they do still care about whether it's espionage or ransomware, other reasons. People do still care about your trade secrets, your intellectual property, all those things that you want to lock down. But they really care about other things that help them in their attack, right? So they care about your network, right? Maps of your network. Well, that shouldn't be accessed, certainly not by the outside. So those are things that you can lock down. They also care about your insurance policy. They want to know what your limits are, because so many of the criminal threat actors use that number against you when they're trying to negotiate a ransom. Well, nobody should be accessing that. That's another step that you could take. Lock down access to your insurance policy. They care a lot about customer lists and banking information for the same reason. We've seen some of the criminal actors, ransomware actors, come against a victim and demand exactly what the balance was from one of their financial institution statements. So that information is being used by these threat actors, and that's actionable. You can take action against that and lock those things down and alert to certain things that are being accessed. Depending on your business, I know that may be accessed more often by a larger number of people than maybe some of the other businesses where it's a smaller number of people. But this is really good information for you to be able to take action and lock it down and prevent the threat actors from using that kind of data against you. So we just encourage you to say, what's happening? How are these threats occurring? And if I think like the attacker, what can I do with that information that would give me an advantage and keep me safer, or to reduce the impact of an attack against me? And those are some things that come to mind. So then when we talk about advancing our security fundamentals, we go to this concentric circles here. And backups really are at the heart of your ability to recover. It's been our experience that you can recover faster from your backups, faster than paying a ransom and trying to use the decryption key, depending on your capabilities. But if you do this right and well, you'll have a far greater outcome than if you're trying to rely on the threat actor to get a decryption key. But you have to think about backups. For years and years and years, we said, okay, you have to have backups. And you want 3 backups, right? 3, 2, 1. You want 3 different copies, 2 different mediums, 1 off-site. Well, now everybody's got backups. That's been a great thing to see. But do you have a big enough clean environment to be able to restore from the backups? Can you do that effectively and efficiently and in a prioritized manner so that you can bring the business units back up and online again in a way that makes sense for your business during a time when you are otherwise experiencing a lot of interruption in your business? And what kind of data do you need in that time? Because the threat actors are often, taking Active Directory offline. There's a lot of data that you would need for communications in your company, or customer lists, or all kinds of information that may not be accessible to you and may be offline for a period of time. So what is your plan for that restoring from your backups, and can you do it? So now we talk about backups, like, okay, do you have them? Pretty much that answer now is yes, and that's a significant improvement from where we were years ago. Are you protecting them? So are you doing things like write once, read many? Are you encrypting them? Do you have the identity and access management around it so that you're alerting to anybody who's trying to get to your backups? Are you alerting to changes or preventing changes from happening to your backups? Because what the threat actors are doing now, they've figured out that if something's really important to you, you're probably backing it up. So the most important data that they're interested in might be in your backups. So they're very interested in your backups. So they're interested in your backups not only for the data, but then also to interrupt your ability to recover so that they can pressure you to pay the ransom. So really having a lot of protection around your backups can really put you in a better position. And then using or being able to restore from those backups. Do you have a big enough clean environment? And are you able to do that in a dynamic way while the rest of your business might be suffering for a period of time? So then we move on to, you think about segmentation, which I think it can sound like an old term. So I think to modernize the term, access control, right? And thinking in terms of what are you doing to implement principles of least privilege access? We've heard of some customers even trying to whitelist on their servers. And while that might be very effective, it's highly manual. And what we're really encouraging people to do is look at how many automated processes can you put into place and how can you automate testing and validate that your controls are working, that your alerts are there, that your defenses are functioning as you would expect them to function, so that you have confidence when you have to make a decision in a critical period of time that you know that you're protected, or you know your ability to close off access from a threat actor who might be in your environment, and you have the confidence to continue operating, and you're not forced to make a decision to close parts of your business down that you otherwise might not have to, that might be able to operate just fine throughout the course of an attack. So that's really important, and customers ask us all the time. It's funny. I was recently talking to a very, very large company, and the company was talking about adding an additional multi-factor authentication to a piece of their business and how they were going to operate. There was huge uprising against it, and then they asked us. They said, "Well, how does Mandiant do it?" Like, well, we have multiple levels of authentication. We re-authenticate multiple ways, multiple times a day, every single day. And then they asked, well, how does Google do it? Like, well, Google architects down to the object level. So, it cuts off a lot of threat vectors that maybe might be in place for others. But there are times when it's inconvenient, no matter which way you go. There are times when it's inconvenient, but it hasn't closed us down as a business, right? So we've found ways to be safe and do these things and implement them in a way that's very effective. And it also has allowed us to quickly identify what is normal activity and what is abnormal activity. And that was really behind, SolarWinds, why Mandiant was able to detect SolarWinds when so many others were not able to. It's because we had multi-factor authentication everywhere. We knew our environment well enough to be able to detect an anomaly in the multi-factor authentication, and we had the resources and commitment to fully investigate something that was anomalous. So that's really what it takes if you want to be able to have that kind of protection. And then patching, our industry has come a very long way, and to understand, hey, we have to patch. We can't do it just once a month or once a week, or we have to really be on top of our game with a lot of the patching, particularly with the CVEs that are coming out. But I also know that this is an area that can be resource intensive. And some companies try to patch all critical vulnerabilities. And I think that that's really a very hard way to go. And it might not be the best use of your resources. So we're really advocating that people use a risk-based approach to your patching and to your vulnerability management. You have to really look and see, like, to your question earlier, when I was indicating that Mandiant's publishing information to its customers about this is the CVE, but here's who's exploiting it, here's how they're exploiting it, and against which industries. So if you're in that industry, it might be a priority for you. Or if you have a compensating control, it might not be a priority for you. Or if it's being exploited in a system that's not critical to you, maybe it's not a priority for you. So really using a risk-based approach to your patch management and vulnerability management is really better than falling into a trap of thinking that you have to patch all CVEs. And that's also, again, why it's so important to be intelligence-led in your approach. When we think about inventory, this is something that's where I'm very excited, because there's so much new technology out there for automation to do attack surface management and to really give you a good sense of where do you have externally facing assets, identify those, show you where some of those vulnerabilities or access points might be, help you prioritize where you want to close those off, and then work on a plan so that you can actually close those off. It's interesting to me because whether I was in the FBI or when I was in, or whether it's Mandiant, we'll do victim notifications. And it's interesting how some of the victims respond, because maybe Mandiant comes across some information to say, oh, this company is a victim and they may not know it yet. We want to let them know. Or if it's the FBI, we come across information to think, oh, this company is a victim. They may not know. We want to give them a notification and let them know. And sometimes the reaction is, oh no, that's a system that's not externally facing. It's like, well, yeah, it is, because we saw it. And it's, so it's interesting because you think of your environment a certain way because you know it a certain way, but the threat actor or an outsider sees it differently. And now that there's automation that can look at it and map it and check it on a continuous basis, that's really valuable to you. So really check out that technology and see if that technology is something that you can implement to be able to really understand what a threat actor is seeing from the outside and what they could use to compromise you. And it's also interesting to me that sometimes when we do a victim notification, people will respond and say, oh yeah, we closed it. Okay, well, did you do a compromise assessment? Because I think a lot of times people do close a vulnerability, but they may not do a full compromise assessment to see, did somebody actually compromise them while they were vulnerable? And so that's another thing that we urge people to really think about and make sure that they're just putting into practice all the time. And we talk about watching, right? What do you watch for? Well, again, it's using the intelligence that we know about how threat actors behave in your networks and making sure that you're constantly threat hunting for that kind of activity. And then the last one I have here is practicing your incident response playbook. And we've heard this for years, right? Practice, practice, practice. I'm still amazed that sometimes people don't, or sometimes they'll tabletop once every 2 years. That may be enough. It may not be enough. You really want to think about what can you do to make sure that you're testing and you're checking and you really feel like you're ready, because it's going to be that confidence in your readiness that's going to guide so many of the decisions that you have to make while you're under the stress of a breach or a compromise. And you want to reduce that down as much as possible so that you say, oh no, I know where my confidence level is. I know what we are capable of. I know what I can or can't do. And I know where my attention needs to go. So when we think about practicing your incident response playbook, if we take and we apply what we're seeing from the threat perspective, the types of scenarios that you now need to be thinking about are you prepared for destructive malware? Are you prepared for an ongoing attack that is intended not only to bring your business down for a period of time, but is also designed to thwart your recovery efforts? Are you prepared for a highly destructive attack? You might be in a critical infrastructure industry, and that's an industry that might be hit with a destructive attack or highly disruptive attack. Have you practiced identifying and responding to multiple threat actors? Right, we go back to the statistic, 27% of the time we're seeing multiple threat actors in a single victim environment. Have you practiced that? Do you know if you have the resources to handle that level of an attack or that kind of situation if you find yourself in it? And I know some people say, well, we can't turn off the internet. We can't practice it in the red lever events because time is money. And my response is downtime is more money. Sometimes you really need to take that proactive step to test and make sure that you know what happens if you have to make certain decisions or if you have to stop or shut off certain connection points because you're in a situation that just requires you to do that.
Yeah, we've seen that often. I think with like manufacturing, for instance, right, where like plants, even in cases, are taken offline,
Right.
and just the substantial cost of the business side of things. So, hey, I think on the defense side, there's a few takeaways I got, which I found interesting. I think a few things, planning ahead of time, automating as much as possible, as it relates to, patch management, vulnerability management. And then I think really what you're highlighting is, then having the precision and increasing your velocity to focus on the things that matter most, and having context on the VM side. You also mentioned, and I'm a big fan, hardened credentials. I was early Duo and spent 8 years there, but I still think like people are like, well, I implemented MFA, but like they haven't implemented newer, more modern frameworks like FIDO, U2F, passkeys, which are fish proof. And so I have a whole set of those on my keys that I use for my advanced security, personal Gmail accounts, stuff like that, which is really important. And then someone asked the question, right? As far as being able to see what you don't know, like you fix a vulnerability or you remove RDP from the public internet, but making sure that you haven't been compromised, right? Just because you fix a vulnerability. And personally, it's like, I remember days when I was on the more the implementation side and discovering like firewall rules open any inbound, right? And in ITAR environments. And so that stuff realistically really happens, right? And I think that's something really important, is it's not about checking the box and saying we fixed it. It's also like, do some due diligence and some investigation to make sure there's not bad actors in your environment. So super
Right.
cool. And then someone asked a question about, what are some of the best ways to identify your assets public facing? And I think you mentioned attack surface management, but is there anything you wanted to add there?
This is really great because attack surface management that Mandiant came out with, and now is powered by Google Cloud. It just gives you a really great capability, and Google actually Google Cloud just announced that we have it for cloud as well. So, and we're not the only ones that have these capabilities. I really encourage you to get out and see those capabilities that are now being offered by Mandiant, by Google Cloud, by others, because there are solutions out there that did not exist a few years ago. So there's been a lot of advancement in this area where there's just automated capabilities that test your externally facing assets and really reveal and show you, this is what an attacker would see, this is where you're vulnerable, and this is how you can prioritize closing some of those vulnerabilities. So really get out there and see what those capabilities are. And when we talked about the automation, one of the things I just wanted to mention that I'm super excited about is Google Cloud's really been training large language models, and now we have them trained in security. So now we have this Mandiant intelligence that we brought in, the Google Cloud intelligence that we have there from protecting all of the Google Cloud customers as well. So this combined intelligence with large language models that are trained in security that now have the capability of alerting you to say, hey, this is what we're seeing on the front lines. This is what we're seeing. This is what it means. Here's an executive summary. Here's some things that you can dig deeper in if you need to know more about the technical details of it. And then these are the suggested actions. So it supplements your personnel. It supplements your SOC. It supplements your capabilities that you have so that the humans can get this information much faster and make decisions and get to a place of understanding it much faster than ever before. So we're excited about all of those capabilities and the new technology, but whether it's us or somebody else, I just continue to encourage you, keep up on what's happening, because these capabilities are critical to increase your security posture.
Absolutely. So pulling up a little level a bit and talking about cyber resilience, let's talk about how organizations need to approach the larger cybersecurity plan. We've talked about threats, trends, and what cyber defenders can do. What should leaderships across businesses be doing in organizations, right? It might not be a business. So their businesses remain resilient.
Yeah, and I really think about leadership readiness is business resilience. I mean, the cyber readiness is business resilience, right? These are all interrelated. Andrea, if we can switch the slide here. So yeah, we do want to talk about what leaders do and how they need to be thinking about things. And I always encourage you to look at cyber risk as business risk, right? It's all part of your resilience as a company. And you want to think about preparing your people and testing your systems and technology. And I say that very deliberately, prepare people, test systems and technology. Why? Because people don't like to be tested, right? So if you test your people and you fail, right, that's a really hard thing.
I hate phishing assessments. Like, I mean, self-admittedly, like every time I fail one, it's just like, oh,
right.
Sorry. But
Yeah,
you do have to test your people.
Right. But you don't want to, right? You want to prepare your people. And it's a really interesting difference in the approach and how your most valuable resource, your people, right? You want them to feel invested. You want to feel them to feel like I matter, what I do matters. I'm part of the company. I'm a frontline defender, right? Because if I let something in, that's bad for everybody. But you want to create an environment where they feel comfortable reporting, hey, I made a mistake, or I think I made a mistake, or I may have made a mistake, right? You want to encourage that people to come forward with that so that you're preparing them. You want them to know we're investing in you. We want you to know about these threats. We want you to know about the different ways that the attackers might come at you. We want you to understand what this looks like, and we want you to feel like you can report it, because the faster you report something, the faster we can address it, right? And so you want people to feel very invested in by the company so that they invest, right, in the company. So it's just a really important thing for a leader to do. And think about building a bench, right? You need a bench, because so often people say, oh yeah, we test all the time. Do you test with the same people all the time? Are the same people at your tabletop exercise all the time? Are the same people doing the incident response all the time? Are the same people making at the table, seeing how things unfold all the time? Or are you building a bench of people who can do this? Because oftentimes, right, people aren't at work sometimes, people aren't accessible sometimes. And it also goes into building a team of people in your company who feel like, hey, my company's investing in me. They want me to know what to do and how to respond and what's going to happen. They're teaching me how to work across all the different business units when something happens so that we can respond more effectively, right? I'm learning more about the business because I'm engaged in the practices that we're holding and that we're having, so that we understand what all the different business units will do across the entire company if something were to happen, right? So it's really making sure that you have a bench of leaders, because again, if the investigation of a breach goes on for a long period of time, you won't be able to just rely on the same 2 people or the same 10 people. You're going to need to pull in additional resources, and that means you need a lot of people who understand what's happening and what their role and responsibility is and what's happening across the company. So really think about bringing other people in. Let them observe, let them be part of it, teach them, build that bench, because you might need them. If it's a very short incident, maybe not. But if it goes on for a period of time, the only way you're going to be ready is if you have a bench of people and if you create an ecosystem, and we're going to talk about that in just a minute. But the other thing I encourage businesses to really consider is, have you really done an assessment of how you would recover and what your priorities are across all business units? Because too often each individual business unit operates on its own or in a silo in many ways. But then if a large significant incident were to occur, maybe it's not clear. Everybody thinks, oh, well, this part of my business is the number 1 priority. And then somebody over here says, oh no, this part of my business is the number 1 priority, right? That could have been decided well in advance. And I use this example. On my street where I live, there's a number right on the street sign, a little number. And that number tells where I am in the list of priorities of when I'm going to be plowed, or when an emergency clearing would happen if I'm on an emergency street or if I'm not on an emergency street. Am I going to be plowed first or cleared first? Or am I going to be cleared, number 12,000 or number 50,000, right? Where am I in the pecking order? Where am I in the list of priorities? Well, think about that across your business so that you can really think about, okay, yes, each individual business unit needs to say these are the things that are most critical for my business function, but across the business, make those decisions so that everybody knows what will happen and how things will be restored and in what order, so that your IT folks aren't working against each other, not knowing that they are, right? That they're going to try to do what they think is right for the business that they support, but maybe across the business, it's a different set of priorities. So those are all tips that we want to make sure that you're giving internally. You want to make sure you're communicating internally, testing, preparing your people, educating your people, letting them know what's new and novel, what's happening, and then how would you respond if you had an incident, and who does what, and making sure that you continue to build a bench of people who can support those efforts. Now, one of the key things is I've been part of organizational change or led organizational change many, many times. And what I learned is typically for something significant, whatever the something significant is, so here you're talking about a significant breach of some sort, you need a team that's dedicated to the ongoing business. And you need a different team that's dedicated to the problem set, whatever it is you're dealing with, because the same people have a very hard time doing both, right? So that's a really serious consideration, particularly for a large business, to say who's going to focus on the day-to-day business activities and keeping those running for business continuity purposes, and who's going to focus on the incident and for how long, and do I have 3 shifts a day, right? Because you'll wear your people out, right? You can't expect them to do 24/7 for a long period of time if you have an extended investigation that needs to happen. So internally, that's how I think about that kind of preparedness.
So taking that internal preparedness, right, then how do you coordinate? Because I think a big part of this is, extending that bench beyond just your team. So how do you coordinate with third parties, federal agencies, government, those sorts of things? I'd love to hear a little bit about your advice there, since you have a background both with the incident response side, but also the government side.
Yeah, absolutely. So important that you think about this as the whole ecosystem. So when you think about your third parties, right, who are your external stakeholders? And this is where having a communication plan in place is absolutely critical. It's so important that Mandiant actually built a communications practice. So now we help customers with those communications. And it's critical because so many of those communications can be drafted in advance. And then it's just a matter of filling in the very specifics that are needed. But you can have those communications ready to go. And then it's really important that you know inside your business who's authorized to approve those and to put the information in them, and who's responsible, right, for doing those things to make sure that the information that you want to share is approved in the way that you expect it to be approved, reviewed in the way you expect it to be reviewed, and that those communications can happen very, very quickly. Because as we know, your external stakeholders, once they hear there's a problem, right, you're already behind the curve. You don't want them to hear it from anyone else. You want them to hear it from you.
I'm just thinking Dark Radiant and SC Magazine are already talking about it, right?
Right.
They're publishing stuff. It's not good to be on in that position, right?
And so often companies will say, oh, well, I have a retainer with a communications company. We would turn to them and they would handle it. That might be sufficient, but it might not. And here's why. You really need to think about, first of all, do they already have the communications ready to go? Have you looked at them? Have you worked this out to where you're comfortable with what those communications are? Or are you just going to pick up the phone and figure it out for the first time when you're under duress? Like that's not the time you want that to happen. The second thing is, so much of what the incident responders are doing is the information that they will need to know and understand so that they know what they want to draft and what they want to say. And that's why one of the many, many reasons that Mandiant built its own communication practice is because we found that the incident responders are just sharing that information and trying to explain everything to these communication companies that don't have that expertise. And then that takes away the time from focusing on recovering from the breach, right? So these are just things you need to think about and just think through and just understand so that you can make a really good decision for your business to be at optimal readiness. So you do want to think about things like, do you have outside counsel? How does outside counsel work with your business? How does all that work? Your insurance companies, right? So of course you're going to reach out to your cyber insurance, but you could also be working with them well in advance and demonstrating to them your security practices, not only for insurability, but also for rates and readiness. And then of course, you want to make sure that you know who you're going to call if there's a list that they require you to use, or if you already made a decision that you know who you're going to use. So those are things you can have figured out well in advance. Your customers, right? What's your communication plan with your customers? Your board, right? Who on the board needs to be notified? What do they want to know? By when? What is the cadence that you're going to establish to make sure that you have regular communications? So, people expect communication at a certain point, and you want to have those cadences, at least figured out in advance to a point where you say, okay, here's what I know I could support. Here's what I know I could do. These are the most important people we need to notify right away. And then here's how we would continue after we get those initial notifications done. And of course, some of those notifications are also going to be to regulators and shareholders. There's going to be public statements depending on what kind of organization you are. So you want to make sure that you've got your public communications figured out well in advance. You know exactly how that's all going to flow, because again, in the middle of crisis or crisis management, it gets harder if you don't have those things already prearranged and at least have a good plan. And this is where the incident response retainers are critical. I'm surprised how many companies are still thinking that they would call somebody and get somebody. And here's my at least experience with that is it might work, that might be fine, but it might not be, because so many of these campaigns that the threat actors are using, they're not just conducting one breach, two breach, three, right? It's hundreds, sometimes thousands of victims. And if all these victims get hit at once, and they all think that they're going to get an incident response company to come out in a very short time, that might be a surprising wake-up call that they don't want, right? So you really want to make sure you've got that incident response retainer in place and you know what that response time is going to be. Now, government. There's three things I think about when you think about calling government. One, they can help. They have information and capabilities that you don't have. And they want to help you not only get that intelligence and information to you to help stop the threat, but they also have capability and reach to stop it at other points, right? So they have capabilities of stopping that threat perhaps around the world. They have reach through their own legal capabilities or through agreements with other countries, or just through the ways that they've built the public and private sector alliances to be able to combat a threat. So they can go against it at its core, root cause, as opposed to what you're doing, which is just trying to stop it on your system and your network. But a call to the FBI and to CISA can be helpful to you. The second thing I think of is there may be entities you need to contact in government because they have a responsibility there. So it's a regulator, and you have to engage in those conversations. You have to be part of that process. But the third thing I think about when government is responding, because policymakers and lawmakers are looking for, what do we need to do next? With Colonial Pipeline, there were executive orders, DHS directives, new reporting requirements that came out, congressional testimony in some of these cases like SolarWinds. I am sure that business leaders initially never thought of themselves as eventually testifying in front of Congress or being asked by Congress or lawmakers or policymakers, what should we do? What do you advise? What insight can you give us for your industry? So making sure you're thinking about, depending on the nature of your company, if you had an incident or you have a threat that's significant, you might be somebody who can really offer valuable information and valuable insight to policymakers and lawmakers. And so prepare for that.
Hey, that's great advice. I think sometimes people overlook third parties, government, and federal agencies and how to engage. So I think there's two ones. I think you mentioned FBI and CISA, and I think too, like just engaging CISA or FBI. There's regional engagement and then there's federal engagement. So people shouldn't feel super intimidated.
Absolutely not. They're there to help,
yeah.
right? You wouldn't
Yeah,
hesitate to call law enforcement if somebody broke into your house.
The
right?
first incident I experienced was PCI, and it was maybe in like credit cards being stolen, and the company was in denial, and they didn't actually want to call law enforcement because they thought they'd get in trouble. Right. And so it's like that went on for 6 months, and all these people's credit cards got stolen. And so I'm a little bit cynical and laughing about that, but it's like you don't want that to happen. You want to get help as soon as you can. Which is really, really important. Well, hey, I'd like to, just wrap up. I'm so thankful for your time and the discussion today on cybersecurity resilience and, actions that organizations can take regarding different threats out there and defending their environment. So thank you so much, Erin, Joe, for coming on. As we approach the end of the session, I want to thank Mandiant and you for joining us. Mandiant Vulnerability Intelligence is included as a part of Nucleus service offering to all customers at no additional cost. So we love the partnership and engagement with Mandiant through Nucleus. Also, Mandiant offers a managed service for vulnerability management, which is powered by Nucleus. So just want to highlight that as well. You can learn more about Mandiant if you want to head to their website. The blog content, as you mentioned, is very rich on different advice, intelligence, and whatnot. And then last, just want to promote and highlight a few different things. Feel free to connect with us on LinkedIn. It's always good to engage there. If you enjoyed today's webinar, I also encourage you to sign up for the next one in our series. We'll be covering stakeholder-specific vulnerability categorization, something that CIS has adopted actually. And we'll have Stephen Schaefer from Peloton, as well as maybe 2 additional special guests. We're waiting for final approval that are heavily involved in SSVC and stakeholder vulnerability categorization. So thanks so much for everyone attending today. Is there any last advice or words, Erin, Joe, that you would like to leave people with?
Oh, I just always say, get that good threat intel, operationalize it, prepare your people, practice, and get the confidence that you need to be ready and resilient.
It's great advice. Thanks so much. And then we'll send out a recording to everyone after this. Greatly appreciate you joining us and coming on. And we look forward to future collaboration with you and Mandiant, a Google Cloud company. So thank you so much. Oh, wait, there might be a few questions. One thing I will highlight, that's a hand raise, but I don't see a question. There are some supply chain questions in here. I think we probably need to do a supply chain webinar with Chris Hughes and Tony Turner. So just want to acknowledge for those that mentioned that in the comment. And then there's a few questions that I'll reach out to afterwards to individuals to help get some more detailed answers. So thanks so much. Have a great day.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. Take care, Patrick.